I was out on an early spring camping trail with my dog, Duke. Duke was a young blue heeler, still medium-sized and incredibly energetic. I was in the middle of training him for our hikes, so I always stuck to trails that were easy to follow but far from busy routes, often ones that didn't have a single review on any hiking app or site. It made training Duke far simpler when there was nobody else around. The camping spot we hiked to was about 2 hours into the forest and looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. It was easily the most isolated place we'd ever been. Duke handled the trail well and stayed calm during the first few hours we spent around camp. He still had loads of energy, but I was exhausted. Once the sun went down, I crawled into the tent and tried to sleep. Duke was in there with me, of course. But about 3 hours after sunset, he started growing very restless. Not in a restless, wide-awake way. It seemed more like anxiety. I eventually unzipped the tent and let him out, hoping maybe he just needed to relieve himself. But when I stepped outside with him, he didn't go. Duke mostly just paced around the campsite, pausing every few seconds as though he were keeping watch. I'd never seen him act like that before. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area, but there was nothing out there. I stayed outside with him for about 30 minutes before bringing him back in. He clearly didn't want to come, but eventually, he listened and got back into the tent. The rest of that night was terrible. Duke stayed restless and awake, anxiously shifting around in the tent the whole time. By morning, I was so exhausted I didn't even want to get up. When we finally left the tent, Duke went straight back to circling the campsite. While he did, I spotted some odd marks in the dirt behind the tent. They looked like they could be footprints, but it was hard to tell. And if they were, I couldn't say for sure whether they were mine. As I looked closer, I noticed they were all around the campsite. None of them were clear footprints, though. They looked more like someone had dragged their feet through the dirt, leaving no real imprint. If they weren't from me, I felt like I would have noticed them while setting up camp the day before. But I can't be sure. I sat down and made breakfast, watching the sunrise filter through the trees and warm the forest before taking Duke out for a morning walk. There were no trails, so we wandered between the trees in no particular direction. A few minutes in, Duke caught a scent. He was really pulled by it, moving quickly and clearly tracking something. He followed it for a minute or two before stopping. He started sniffing around the same area, going back and forth near the base of a tree, as if he'd suddenly lost the trail. After a minute, figuring it was just another animal, I called Duke back, and we started heading toward the campsite. That day after we got back, everything fell off. The woods were silent, and I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulders, scanning the forest, searching between the trees for anything that could explain the feeling. Duke seemed on high alert too, refusing to rest at all. He'd been like that for nearly 24 hours by then. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, I could tell Duke was really worn out. I built a campfire and tried to get him to lie down in the tent to rest so he wouldn't overdo it. But I could see he was still fighting to keep his eyes open. I sat by the fire, poking at it, listening to the silence that filled the woods. The hours crept by slowly. It was around 10 p.m. when Duke suddenly lifted his head like he'd heard something. Just as I looked at him, a stick landed right in the campsite. I didn't see where it came from because I was looking at Duke. I glanced up, but none of the trees hung low enough over the campsite for it to have simply fallen. Confused and fighting off the unease, I stood up and picked up the stick, then looked around the forest. There was nothing there. It was pitch black and still completely silent. And then another stick landed right in front of me, almost bouncing into the fire. Someone had clearly thrown it. My heart started racing, and Duke came out of the tent, still tired, but the moment he stepped out, he locked onto something in the darkness directly in front of me. I genuinely didn't know what to do. "Hello, who's out there?" I pulled my flip knife out of my pocket and held it ready. About 15 seconds of nothing passed, the fear building in me, before Duke started going crazy, barking, growling, lunging back and forth aggressively. I looked down at him, and he was looking up. I followed his gaze to a tree just outside the campsite, and about halfway up, there was a person staring down at us. He looked tall but thin, motionless, like he thought we couldn't see him. I took a few slow steps back, grabbed my backpack and Duke by the collar, and kept backing up until we reached the trail. The figure stayed frozen in the tree for as long as I could see him, but once we hit the trail, I heard a thump. It sounded like he'd landed on the ground. Then came a quick rustle of leaves, footsteps running toward the campfire. I saw him stop and stand right there in the light, watching us. I turned and sprinted down the trail. Duke stayed right beside me. We eventually made it back to the trailhead and got away. That had to be the creepiest thing I've ever experienced, and I honestly have no idea what that person was doing out there or what he wanted. The way he acted barely seemed human, like a feral animal, which made it even more disturbing. I think if I hadn't a Duke with me, that person would have done far worse than just stalking my campsite, and I probably wouldn't have made it out of that forest alive. My name's Matt, and I'm 28. This happened 3 years ago. I live in a small, older house on the edge of town. My backyard backed up to the woods. Not a forest with trails or anything, but about 15 square miles of wooded area with nothing in it. I don't think anyone ever went in there. Anyway, I lived in that house for a full year before one night I went out to sit on the porch for a while and found a dog lying on my doorstep. She was huddled right against the house next to the door, looking terrified, shaking, and hungry. She was a border collie. I wouldn't say I was the biggest dog person at the time, but I definitely felt bad for her. I went inside and got a bowl of water and some leftover food, which she ate immediately. But every time I tried to get close, she was very hesitant. I figured she must have been someone's dog that ran off, and that the owners would come looking eventually. I stayed outside with her for about an hour before she suddenly perked up, bolted off the porch, and disappeared into the dark. That was my first encounter with her. But over the next month, every single night, I'd find her lying on my porch again. I tried calling animal services to pick her up, but she'd always be gone before they could get there. Eventually, she trusted me enough to come inside. So I kept her there until the rescue team came in the morning. I went with them to the vet, and seeing her so scared but calm near me, I couldn't let her go. I officially adopted her. I named her Grace and took her home. I watched her all day as she explored the house and settled in. Still skittish, but much better than when I'd first found her. That night, I let her sleep on a pile of blankets in my room. Exhausted from the day, I fell asleep almost immediately. In the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., I woke to loud knocks echoing through the house. I sat up quickly and saw Grace cowering in the corner, terrified and shaking just like she had been on my porch. The knocking didn't stop. Someone was at my front door. I was groggy and tired, but what could someone be doing here this late? I walked downstairs and up to the door. Grace didn't follow. When I looked out, I didn't see anyone. But after a second, I noticed a shadow move. Someone was on the far side of the porch by the living room window, probably leaning against it and trying to peer in. I was too scared to go to the window and look, so I stayed by the door and kept watching from there. Eventually, I heard him leave from the side. I never got a chance to see who it actually was. It was creepy and extremely weird, so I stayed downstairs for a while to make sure he didn't come back. By 2:30, with no more signs of anyone, I went back upstairs. Grace looked calmer, but still a little shaken. I got in bed and slept until morning. That was the only time I had any nighttime visitors. So for a while, I never found out who it was or what they wanted. However, over the next 2 weeks, Grace kept having these strange episodes. Usually, when I let her out in the fenced backyard, she'd be completely normal for a bit before suddenly stopping, facing the woods behind the house, and freezing. It was almost always at night, right before bed, and I never saw anything. But Grace would stay frozen, sometimes for minutes at a time. She'd stare out there, standing in the middle of the yard, looking over the fence at the pitch-black woods. She wouldn't react to my voice or even let me pull her back inside. I'd have to pick her up and carry her because she was so shaken by whatever she was sensing. After it happened enough times, I knew Grace was sensing something real out there, not just imagining it. And whatever it was, it terrified her. But exactly 15 days after I'd officially brought her home, I let Grace out as usual that night. And again, she stopped and froze. I was watching from the kitchen window, feeling sorry for her, but also sensing something different about this time. I don't know what it was, but something fell off. And then, after a minute, she suddenly bolted toward the fence, jumped over it, and fled into the woods. I grabbed a flashlight and ran after her without even thinking. Right when I got to the edge of the woods, I saw her way back in the trees, barely lit by my flashlight. I called her name and ran toward her, but when I got closer, she ran deeper in. This kept happening, like she was deliberately waiting for me just to run further, like she was luring me somewhere. If I had to guess, I chased her for about 2 miles through the dark before she finally stopped and didn't run off. As I approached, my light started to pick up something behind her. There was a cabin, or more like a wooden shack, not well-built, small, and very run down. I started to get really freaked out, but I knew Grace must have led me here for a reason, and I thought this might give me answers about where she'd come from weeks ago. So I pushed open the door. The hinges made a loud creak that echoed through the entire forest. Inside, the shack was basically empty except for one thing. There was another dog, different breed than Grace, much smaller, tied to the wall. It looked just like Grace had when I first saw her, lying down, shaking, terrified. I went over and loosened the collar enough for it to slip out, but I was still scared and unsure about what was going on. I turned and looked back at Grace while thinking. She was frozen. I called her name, and she didn't move. Her head was facing into the trees, staring at the darkness. And then I started to hear it. Footsteps in the distance, walking toward us. I immediately picked up Grace and started running. The other dog followed, heading back into the trees toward my home. After half a mile, I put Grace down, and she was able to run on her own. We eventually reached the tree line of my backyard. But when I turned around, the other dog was gone. I'm still pretty sure it got away and must have run off somewhere else in the neighborhood. I got back inside and called the cops. Officers came that night for my report and went out the next day to investigate. The shelter was abandoned, even more so than when I'd found it. No dogs there, and whoever had been out there was gone too. Ultimately, we never figured out what was really going on. But in the following days, I noticed Grace never had any more of those freezing episodes. She never got scared or froze in the backyard anymore. So, putting it all together, I think Grace knew that man and could sense when he was close. And almost every night, he'd approach the backyard from the woods, making Grace freeze in fear. I think he was looking for a chance to steal her back, but clearly I'd never let that happen. Not after what I saw. Anyway, 3 years later, she's doing great. Honestly, after those first strange weeks, I couldn't have asked for a better dog. I don't think I'll ever really know what was going on in the woods behind my house, but something tells me if I hadn't gone out there and found that shelter, that man would have kept coming to my backyard every single night, and things might not have ended well for me or Grace. Last year, my sister and her fiancé went on an overseas trip for their anniversary. They had a small dog named Piper they couldn't take with them. So I offered a dog sit while they were away for a couple of weeks. The bonus was that I'd get to stay at their house, a nice ranch home, sort of in the woods, but still close enough to town to not feel isolated. Piper was the easiest dog to sit. She lounged around all day, never barked or whined, and just liked to follow me everywhere. I had a remote job at the time, so that made it even better. I'd set up my laptop on a small desk in the bedroom, and Piper would sleep on the bed behind me while I worked. The first few days went smoothly, and on Friday I had a call with my sister to confirm everything was fine. Aside from that, me and Piper hung around watching TV all night. When I let her outside before bed, though, I noticed she was a bit more hesitant than usual. The house didn't have a fence. It was just a big yard with some trees and bushes. Piper stayed right by the house, quickly doing her business and running back in. No sniffing or lingering like she usually would. I figured there were coyotes or something nearby. However, just 10 minutes later, while I was in the shower getting ready for bed, I heard the doorbell ring downstairs. It only rang once, but I was absolutely sure it was the doorbell. I finished up quickly, got dressed, and went downstairs to check the front door. No one was there, and for what I could see, there weren't any cars in the driveway either. It was a little past 10 o'clock, so I really didn't know why someone would show up this late, especially at a house out here. After a minute, I started walking back upstairs, and just as I did, I heard something outside. Piper was right next to me and started whining, which she almost never does, and a few seconds later, the doorbell rang again. This time, when I looked out, there was a guy there. I watched him through the peephole for a moment. Ashley? Ashley, you home? Hello. He started calling out my sister's name, and weirdly, I felt like he looked kind of familiar. I felt like I'd seen him before, but I couldn't place when or where. I opened the door just a crack. The man looked at me with a straight face, then looked down at Piper, then back at me before giving a fake smile. Hey, is Ashley home? No, she's not. Do you know her? Why are you here so late anyway? He nodded and apologized, saying he was just a friend stopping by because he was in the area. As I processed the strange situation, I noticed how eerily quiet it was outside. I could actually see his car sitting in the dark, far back on the driveway. Something really didn't feel right. The guy knelt down and started saying hi to Piper, but I put my leg out to block her from leaving and to keep him from touching her. It's pretty late, and like I said, Ashley isn't home right now. Maybe send a text next time. He seemed unhappy with that answer and offended that I wouldn't let him near Piper, but he said all righty and started to walk off. I'll let her know you stopped by, I said as I started closing the door. As soon as I said that, the man paused for a moment, like he was going to say something. But then he just kept walking. I closed and locked the door, then watched him walk all the way down the driveway and get into his car. I pulled out my phone and started texting my sister, but realized I never even got his name. So I just let her know that some guy had shown up asking about her. I knew she probably wouldn't respond for 3 or 4 hours because of the time difference, so I didn't bother waiting. After that, I went back upstairs and got in bed. Despite the unusual encounter, I fell asleep within 20 minutes. The next time I opened my eyes, I knew it was still the middle of the night. The room was pitch black. I reached for my phone to check the time, but I couldn't find it. Before I could get up to look, I heard Piper whine. That immediately worried me because Piper rarely ever made noise. So I knew something was wrong. I turned and looked to the other side of the room by Piper's dog bed. I could barely see anything. All I could see was movement in the darkness. I jumped out of bed and ran for the lights. Just 5 feet from the bed, there was a man reaching down to grab Piper. She was trying to move away, but he caught her before she could. The guy didn't even seem bothered that I saw him. Even though he was dressed in black, I could tell it was the same man from the front door earlier. He turned to face me, still holding Piper, and told me to move. I was standing in the doorway, of course not going to let him leave with the dog. He didn't seem to have any weapons, but he was a big guy, and he looked really angry. I told him to put the dog down, and I'd let him leave without any trouble. His face didn't change, just anger, no other emotion. He started walking toward me, and I realized I had to act. So I tried ramming my shoulder into him while reaching for Piper. It kind of worked. I got beat up pretty badly, but I managed to get the dog, and after a minute of struggle, he suddenly got up and ran. After the cops came and a long call with my sister using the cop's phone. Since the guy actually stole mine, I was able to describe the man well enough from our front door interaction to get an ID. It was my sister's ex-boyfriend from 4 years ago. They briefly had a thing for about 5 or 6 months, and I never actually met him. I'd only seen a few photos, which is why he looked somewhat familiar. The strange part is they hadn't had any contact in 4 years. So why this happened now is crazy. After a warrant was out for a week, the cops finally caught him by tracking my phone. Supposedly, he'd been stalking her house for a while, and his plan was to steal Piper to use as some kind of ransom to force my sister to get back with him. Total psychopath for even thinking that would work. I still can't believe how quietly he broke in and sneaked into the bedroom while I was asleep. I mean, he could have killed me right there if he'd wanted to. Thankfully, everyone, including Piper, was okay though,